What really makes an action moral? I mean, how can we be truly sure we're doing the right thing? Not just, acting out of habit or because we want something or maybe just because we're worried about what happens if we don't.
Yeah, that's the big one, isn't it?
Is there some kind of objective standard, like a rule maybe, that applies to everyone everywhere, no matter how they feel or their culture or even what the outcome is?
They're absolutely foundational questions that really dig deep into what it means for us as beings who can actually make choices to figure out right from wrong. Philosophers have been wrestling with finding a solid ground for morality for, well, centuries.
And today, we're taking a deep dive into one of the most rigorous, maybe even demanding attempts to answer exactly these questions. We're looking at Immanuel Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals.
Kant's goal in the groundwork is incredibly ambitious, very specific. He sets out to find and establish nothing less than the supreme principle of morality itself.
The supreme principle.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. He wants to lay a purely rational foundation for moral philosophy, one that's completely separate from anything empirical, anything that comes from experience, human psychology, specific situations, or even the results you hope for. For Kant, this supreme principle has to be found a priori.
A priori, meaning?
Meaning it's discovered just by thinking, purely within the concepts of reason itself, totally independent of any experience of the world.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack Kant's argument step by step. We're using the source material you've gathered, key bits from the groundwork itself, plus some commentary to help sort of light the way through his, let's face it, often dense ideas.
It can be dense, that's true.
We want to get a handle on his core arguments about morality, duty, that famous categorical imperative, and how he links it all to freedom, and maybe see what these pretty demanding ideas might offer us when we think about our own moral compass.
It definitely requires some focus, but the payoff is, I think, immense. Kant builds his case really systematically, and he kicks it all off with a pretty bold claim about what's truly fundamentally good.
Right. He starts by pinpointing what he thinks is the only thing that is good without qualification, or good in itself, and that one thing is a good will.
That's it. Kant states, quite dramatically really, that the only thing in the world or even beyond it that you could possibly call good without any qualification whatsoever is a good will.
But, hang on. Why only a good will? Usually we think lots of things are good, don't we? Like intelligence, or being brave, or even just good luck, health, money, happiness.
And Kant doesn't disagree that those things can be good. Intelligence, wit, judgment, courage, perseverance, even things like power, wealth, honor, happiness. He agrees. They're often desirable. But, and this is the crucial part, they are not good with that qualification. Their goodness is, well, it's conditional.
Conditional. Conditional on what?
Conditional on the will that's using them. Think about it, right? Someone really smart, but who uses that intelligence to plan something awful? Does that intelligence seem good then?
No. Seems terrible.
Exactly. Or courage in someone doing evil things. That's terrifying. Even happiness, if someone gets it by being completely immoral, doesn't that feel wrong? These qualities, Kant says, can be extremely bad and harmful if the will behind them, the will using them, isn't good.
So their value really depends on the moral character of the person who has them.
Precisely. Their goodness isn't baked in. It depends on how they're used. It's instrumental. But a good will, that's different. Its goodness doesn't come from what it achieves or accomplishes. It doesn't matter if it succeeds or fails. Its goodness comes purely from the willing itself, from the intention, the volition. Its value is intrinsic.
The source material has that really striking image to make this point.
It really does. It asks you to picture a good will that maybe through sheer bad luck, or as Kant puts it, disfavor of fortune, or by the niggardly provision of a stepmotherly nature, just completely lacks the power to achieve what it intends.
Like someone tries their absolute hardest to do good, purely motivated by goodwill, but everything conspires against them and they achieve nothing.
Exactly. Even in that extreme case, Kant insists the goodwill would still shine by itself as something that has its full worth in itself. Whether it's useful or completely fruitless, that can't add or subtract from its inherent, unconditional worth.
That's quite a shift in perspective. It pulls the focus entirely away from the outcome onto the inner principle, the willing. The value isn't in the success, it's in the moral drive itself.
That's the core idea. And Kant argues that reason, our capacity for rational thought, which is supposed to influence our will's true purpose, isn't just to help us figure out how to be happy or achieve other external goals. No, Its highest, truest calling is to produce a will that is good in itself, not just good as a means to something else.
So the goodwill isn't maybe the whole story of the good life because happiness matters too.
Right. It's not the sole or complete good. Kant acknowledges happiness is desirable too, but the goodwill must be the supreme good. It's the fundamental condition that makes anything else, even happiness, genuinely good or deserved.
Okay, so we have the goodwill as the only unqualified good. How does this connect to his concept of duty? Because duty is, well, it's another huge pillar in Kant's ethics, and it's often where people find his ideas pretty challenging.
It is challenging, no doubt,
Oh, yeah?
and it leads directly to one of Kant's most critical and sometimes controversial distinctions, the difference between acting from duty and merely acting in conformity with duty.
Wait, hold on. Isn't just doing the right thing, conforming to what duty requires, isn't that enough? Why does the reason you do it, the motive, matter so much for Kant?
For Kant, when we're talking about moral worth, the motive is absolutely everything. An action might look right from the outside. It might line up perfectly with what duty demands. But if it's done for any reason other than duty itself, it lacks true moral worth in his specific sense.
So just happening to do the right thing isn't good enough morally.
Not for genuine moral credit, no. Acting merely in conformity with duty might just be accidental. Or it could be based on unstable things like self-interest or feelings. If you do the right thing today because it benefits you, what happens tomorrow when doing the right thing doesn't benefit you? That underlying principle, self-interest, could easily lead you to act against duty then.
Ah, I see. So the consistency matters.
Right. Only actions done from duty, meaning you do them because it's the moral law, because it's the right thing to do according to reason. Only those actions have genuine moral worth. Their underlying principle is pure. It's free from the influence of those shifting, contingent things like personal desires, inclinations, or the results you're hoping for.
Let's unpack this with the examples. The sources mention, or at least allude to, the classic one, the honest shopkeeper.
Yes, it's a standard illustration. Imagine a shopkeeper who has a chance to overcharge a customer who clearly wouldn't know any better. But the shopkeeper doesn't do it. They charge the fair price. Now, this action certainly conforms to the duty of honesty.
Looks like the right thing to do.
Definitely. But why did they do it? One possibility.
Yeah.
They genuinely believe honesty is morally required, and they act on that principle. They act from duty. Second possibility. They think, well, if I start ripping people off, word will get out, I'll lose business in the long run. In this case, they're still acting in conformity with duty. They're being honest, but the motive is prudence, self-interest, not duty itself.
And from the outside, you can't tell the difference.
Exactly. The action looks identical. But for Kant, only the first shopkeeper, the one acting from the principle of duty, performs an action with true moral worth. The source points out that a principle not rooted in duty, like self-interest, might sometimes lead to law-conforming actions, but it's unreliable and will often lead to actions that contradict the law when interests change.
Okay, that clears it up a bit. It's really digging into the why behind the action. Now, what about the benevolent person example, the person who just loves spreading joy? This one feels even more counterintuitive to me.
It does, and it's often a sticking point for people encountering Kant. He asks us to consider someone with a naturally sympathetic nature. They genuinely find deep pleasure and satisfaction in making other people happy, so they go around doing kind things.
Which seems good.
Absolutely. These actions are good, they're amiable, they conform perfectly with the duty of beneficence. However, Kant argues, if these acts are done only because of that feeling of pleasure or sympathy, if they spring purely from inclination, then, in his technical sense, they have no true moral worth. Morally speaking, they're on the same level as acting from any other inclination, like wanting honor or seeking wealth.
So if I help someone just because it makes me feel good, Kant says that's not morally worthy. That feels harsh. Isn't it a good thing to feel good about helping?
Okay, it's crucial here. Kant isn't saying that having sympathy or enjoying helping is bad, not at all. He's perfectly happy if duty and inclination align. What he's saying is that the source of the action's moral worth can't be those feelings.
Why not?
Because feelings, inclinations, are empirical. They're contingent, they're unstable. They can change day to day, person to person. What if you woke up tomorrow feeling totally miserable and unsympathetic? Would your duty to help others suddenly vanish? For Kant, moral worth needs a basis that's universal, necessary, stable something that doesn't depend on the unpredictable tides of our emotions. And that stable basis is duty, grounded in reason.
Which is exactly why that example of the benevolent person who's clouded by sorrow is so critical in the source material.
Precisely. It's a powerful thought experiment. Imagine this same naturally kind person is suddenly overwhelmed by their own deep personal grief. Let's say this sorrow completely wipes out all their natural sympathy for others. They no longer feel any pleasure in spreading joy.
Right.
But despite this total lack of sympathetic feeling, they still choose to perform acts of kindness for others in need. They drag themselves out of their misery to help, not because they want to, not because it feels good, but solely because it is their duty.
And that action, Kant says,
That action done against inclination, or at least without its support, has far higher worth. It demonstrates the goodness of the will in a pure way.
because in that specific case, it's absolutely clear that the motivation must be duty, not just a warm, fuzzy feeling.
Exactly that. Kant often focuses on these cases where action goes against or is unsupported by inclination because they make it crystal clear that the person is acting from duty, from respect for the moral law itself, rather than just being carried along by other motives. It helps isolate the pure moral reason for the action.
But this raises a tricky point the source mentions too. How can we ever be truly certain about our own motives? It seems so easy to maybe, rationalize or think we're acting purely from duty when maybe some self-interest or desire for approval is mixed in there subconsciously.
That's a really important point, and Kant acknowledges this difficulty. The source notes how hard it is to be absolutely sure of our own deep-down motives. Inclinations can be sneaky, hidden even from ourselves. Are we really acting purely from duty, or just in conformity with duty, because conveniently, duty happens to align with what we wanted anyway? A cool observer, Kant suggests, looking at the complexities of human behavior, might even become skeptical about whether genuine, pure virtue acting solely from duty ever truly happens in the real world.
So if it's that hard to be sure, does that undermine the whole idea? Where does that leave us?
Kant's answer, according to the source, isn't that we need perfect certainty about our motives in every instance. Instead, what saves us from moral paralysis or skepticism is the clear conviction that reason itself commands a priori what we ought to do. We have access to the moral law through reason. We know intellectually what duty demands, even if our own performance is often flawed or our motives are murky. This rational awareness of the ought preserves our respect for duty as the guiding principle.
And this need for a clear, uncorrupted understanding of what reason commands is why philosophy, specifically a metaphysics of morals, becomes necessary, even for ordinary life.
Yes, exactly. Kant thinks common sense, or calming human reason, already has the principle of morality within it and uses it, perhaps implicitly. Like Socrates drawing out knowledge, philosophy can help make this principle explicit and clear. We don't need a PhD to know that, say, honesty is generally good. However, Kant argues a formal metaphysics of morals is indispensable because our everyday moral understanding is very vulnerable to corruption.
How so?
Without a clear supreme canon, a pure, rationally derived principle, we can easily get confused. We start mixing in empirical considerations. What seems to make people happy? What feels good? What are the likely consequences? What do others approve of? We might start watering down morality with self-interest or popular opinion. Seeking moral principles among these empirical factors is, for Kant, highly prejudicial to the purity of morals. Pure philosophy, he believes, is needed to find the moral law in its pure, necessary, universal form, untainted by experience.
So duty isn't just doing the right thing. It's doing the right thing for the right reason. And that reason is a specific kind of motivation, acting out of respect for the moral law itself.
Precisely. And that brings us neatly to Kant's formal definition of duty.
Which is?
Duty, according to Kant in the source, is the necessity of an action done out of respect for the law.
Okay, necessity, it's something we must do. And respect for the law. This word respect feels really important and specific for Kant. It's not just like admiring someone, is it?
No, it's a very technical term. Kant goes to some length to explain it. He says respect for the law is a kind of feeling, yes, but it's unique. It's not a feeling that's passively received through our senses from some external influence like the pleasure we get from nice food or the fear we feel from danger. Instead, he calls it self-wrought by means of a rational concept.
Self-wrought by a rational concept. What does that actually mean?
It means this feeling arises not from external objects or sensory input, but from our own reason, recognizing the authority and validity of the moral law. It's the conscious awareness that our will is subordinate to this law without needing any other influence from our senses or inclinations to make it happen. The immediate determination of our will by the law and our awareness of this, that's what Kant calls respect. Importantly, it's the effect the law has on us, on the subject. It's not the cause or the reason why the law is valid. The law is valid because reason dictates it, not because it makes us feel respect.
Okay, so our reason recognizes the moral law. That recognition directly determines our will, or at least presents itself as something that should determine our will. And the feeling that accompanies this awareness of the law's authority over us is respect.
Exactly. And Kant describes his feeling further. Respect is the awareness of a worth or value, the laws, that infringes upon my self-love. It humbles us, showing that our inclinations and selfish desires must take a backseat to the requirements of the moral law. It's not quite inclination. We don't desire the law like we desire pleasure. And it's not quite fear. We don't fear the law like we fear punishment, ideally. But it has elements of both. The submission to the law feels a bit like constraint or fear, but because it's a law we recognize through our own reason, a law we legislate for ourselves, it feels different from external coercion, more like a rational inclination, though distinct from empirical ones. And the sole object of this unique feeling of respect is always and only the law itself.
And is this connected to what Kant calls moral interest?
Yes, absolutely. The source confirms that all genuine moral interest simply consists in this respect for the law. Reason takes a direct interest in an action when the universal validity of its potential to be a universal law is what alone determines the will. That's a pure interest. Any interest that's indirect, where the will is moved by some desired object, feeling, or outcome, is merely an empirical interest, and that can't be the foundation of morality for Kant.
So, putting it all together, to act from duty means your action is necessary, and the driving force behind it is solely this feeling of respect for the moral law itself. You disregard your personal desires, your inclinations, the potential consequences. The focus is entirely on the principle of the action conforming to the law, simply because it is the law.
That's the core distinction. The moral worth isn't in what you achieve or how you feel about it, but in the will's commitment to the law purely out of respect for the law's rational authority.
All right, we've got the goodwill, acting from duty, respect for the law. But how do we figure out what the law actually commands in specific situations? How do we get from this general idea of the law to concrete moral rules? This seems to be where maxims and imperatives come into play. What's a maxim, exactly, in Kant's system?
Okay, a maxim. A maxim is your subjective principle for action. Think of it as the personal rule or policy you adopt when you decide to act in a certain way. It's the principle you're operating on in that moment.
Like my personal rule of thumb for a situation?
Sort of, yeah. It expresses your intention. For instance, if you're thinking about making a promise you might not be able to keep, your maxim could be something like, whenever I'm in a tight spot, I'll promise whatever is needed to get out of it, even if I know I can't follow through. Or, alternatively, your maxim might be, I will only make promises that I genuinely intend and believe I can keep. It's the underlying principle guiding your specific act of volition.
Okay, that's my subjective rule. How is that different from what Kant calls practical law?
A practical law is the objective principle. It's the rule that would apply to all rational beings if reason had total control over their actions. It's universally valid. Maxims are subjective. They're my principles. Practical laws are objective. They're principles that should guide everyone, derived from reason itself.
And imperatives fit in here how?
Imperatives are basically commands of reason. They take an objective principle, a practical law, and present it as something obligatory for a will that isn't perfectly rational like ours. They're expressed with an ought. They essentially tell a will that can be tempted by inclinations, hey, this action is objectively necessary or good, you ought to do it. They signify a kind of necessitation for imperfectly rational beings like us.
Why do we need an ought? Wouldn't a perfectly rational being, like God maybe, just automatically do what reason says?
It's exactly right. For what Kant calls a holy will, a perfectly rational will, there would be no gap between what reason determines is good and what the will actually does. Its subjective maxims would always perfectly align with objective laws. So, for such a being, there are no imperatives, no oughts. But our will isn't like that. We have desires, feelings, inclinations that can pull us away from what reason tells us is right. That's why, for us, objective laws take the form of commands, of imperatives. You ought to do this, because we might be tempted not to.
And this is where Kant makes that absolutely critical distinction between two types of imperatives, hypothetical and categorical.
Yes, this is fundamental. You really can't understand Kantian ethics without grasping this difference. So, first, hypothetical imperatives. These command an action as a means to achieve something else that you want or might want. Their basic structure is, if you want X, then you ought to do Y.
Like if you want to be a good musician, you ought to practice regularly.
Perfect example. Or, if you want to avoid getting wet, you ought to take an umbrella. These imperatives are conditional. The ought depends on you having a certain goal or desire, being a musician staying dry. They tell you the practical steps needed to reach some other end that you happen to will.
So they're based on relative ends, things we happen to desire.
Exact. And because those desires and goals are relative, they vary from person to person, situation to situation, hypothetical imperatives can't provide universal moral laws that bind everyone, regardless of their personal desires. They only tell you what's instrumentally rational given a certain desired end.
Okay, so those are hypothetical imperatives. What about the categorical imperative?
This is the big one. This is the imperative of morality itself for Kant. A categorical imperative commands an action not as a means to some other end, but as being objectively necessary in itself. It represents an action as intrinsically good, necessary for a will that aligns itself with reason, regardless of any further goal or consequence. It commands absolutely, unconditionally. Its form isn't, if you want X, do Y, it's just do Y, period. Because Y is what reason dictates as right.
And morality for Kant has to be based only on this categorical imperative.
That's right. Because moral laws, as Kant understands them, must have absolute necessity. Think about a command like, you ought not to lie. For Kant, this isn't conditional. It's not, you ought not to lie if you want people to trust you. It's just, you ought not to lie, full stop. It must hold for every rational being, universally, necessarily. Its basis has to be a priori, in pure reason, not dependent on fluctuating desires or empirical outcomes. Only a categorical imperative, commanding unconditionally, can capture this absolute necessary character of moral law. Anything based on empirical grounds or desired ends can only be a practical rule, a hypothetical imperative, not a true moral law.
You mentioned something earlier, that with a hypothetical imperative, you don't know the content until the condition is given, but with a categorical one, you know its content at once. Can you explain that a bit more? It sounds abstract.
Let's try. Take a hypothetical imperative. If you want to bake a cake, you ought to follow the recipe. You don't know what specific action is commanded, follow the recipe, until you know the condition or goal if you want to bake a cake. The content, follow the recipe, depends entirely on the goal.
Makes sense.
Now think about a categorical imperative. It commands unconditionally. There is no if, no external goal or condition attached. It just says, do this because it's rationally necessary. So what is it commanding? Since the command isn't tied to any specific desired outcome or empirical condition, what's left? Only the form of law itself.
The form, you mean, like its structure.
Its universality. Since the imperative doesn't get its content from a particular goal, the only thing it can command is that your principle of action, your maxim, must have the form of universal law. It must be something that could apply to everyone. So the content you know at once isn't a specific action like bake a cake, but rather the requirement of universalizability itself. The command is essentially, act only on principles that you could will to be universal laws. The content is this requirement of universal form. Conformity to universal law is what the imperative represents as necessary.
Okay, so the content is the test of universalizability. That leads us straight into the different ways Kant actually formulated this categorical imperative. The sources say they're basically different formulas for the same underlying law, but maybe they help us grasp it from different angles.
That's exactly Kant's suggestion. He presents several formulations maybe to make this very abstract principle feel a bit more concrete or intuitive. How exactly they relate to each other is something scholars debate endlessly, but they are meant to be equivalent expressions. The first, and maybe most famous, is the formulation of universal law, FUL. Sometimes it's called the formula of universal law of nature.
Hey, what does that one say?
One version from the source is, I ought never to act except in such a way that I could also will that my maxim should become a universal law. Perhaps more standard phrasing also found in the source is, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law without contradiction. This really captures that core idea. The morality of your action hinges on whether the principle behind it could be applied universally to everyone without falling apart. It's a test of the maxim's form.
So the test is, take my personal rule, my maxim for this action. Then imagine a world where everyone acts on the same rule all the time, like it's a law of nature, and then ask what?
Then you ask two key questions. First, can I even think about my maxim operating as a universal law without running into some kind of logical contradiction or self-defeat? Is the scenario even conceivable? Second, even if I can conceive of it, can I rationally will for this maxim to become a universal law without my own will contradicting itself in some way?
Let's use the false promise example again, the one detailed in the source. Someone's broke, needs money, thinking about borrowing with a promise to repay, but they know they absolutely can't. What's the maxim and how does the test run?
Okay, the maxim is something like, When I believe I'm in need of money, I will borrow money and promise to repay it, even though I know I never can. Now let's universalize it. Imagine it becomes a universal law. Everyone in need, knowing they can't repay, makes false promises to borrow money.
What kind of world is that?
Well, in that world, the whole practice of promising would collapse. If everyone knew that promises made under financial duress were routinely false, nobody would believe such promises anymore. The very institution of promising, which relies on a general expectation of truthfulness, would cease to function. You couldn't actually make a promise in that scenario because the necessary trust would be gone.
So the universalized maxim undermines the very action it permits. It destroys itself.
Exactly. As the source puts it, this maxim, as soon as it were made a universal law, would have to destroy itself. You can't even consistently think of it as a universal law without it becoming self-contradictory. The concept falls apart. This kind of logical impossibility, a contradiction in conception, points to what Kant calls strict or narrower duties, often called perfect duties. Things like the duty not to make false promises or the duty not to commit suicide. These allow no exceptions for inclination or convenience.
Okay, that covers duties like not lying. What about the other example mentioned, failing to develop one's talents? The source says we have a duty to enlarge our talents. How does that work with the test?
Right, so imagine someone adopts the maxim, I will neglect my natural talents and devote my life to idleness and amusement instead of developing them. Now universalize that. Imagine a world where everyone lets their talents rust and just seeks pleasure.
Can we imagine that world?
Kant thinks we can, arguably. It's not logically contradictory in the same way the false promise was. We can conceive of a world of universal laziness, even if it seems undesirable. So it passes the first hurdle, no contradiction in conception. However, Kant argues it fails the second hurdle. You cannot rationally will this state of affairs to be a universal law.
Why not? What's the contradiction in the will?
Because, as rational beings, we necessarily will certain things. We will that we have the means to achieve the various ends or goals we might set for ourselves during our lives. Developing our talents and capacities is a necessary means for achieving almost any potential goal. Even if you don't know what you'll want to do later, as a rational being, you necessarily will that you be able to pursue ends effectively.
So, willing the universal neglect of talents.
Means willing a world where the necessary means for achieving ends that you, as a rational being, must will, are systematically destroyed or underdeveloped. Your will would be contradicting itself. On one hand, it necessarily wills the development of capacities as means to potential ends. On the other hand, in willing the universal maxim of neglect, it wills the destruction of those very means. This contradiction in the will is associated with what are often called imperfect duties, duties like developing your talents or helping others, beneficence. These duties are still binding, but they allow some latitude in how and when we fulfill them. The source highlights this kind of contradiction. We might acknowledge the objective necessity of a principle, but still want to make subjective exceptions for ourselves due to inclination, which reveals a contradiction in our own willing, even if we recognize the categorical imperative's validity.
Okay, so the first formulation is all about universalizability. Can the principle be thought and willed as universal law without contradiction? What's the second big formulation?
The second is hugely influential. The formulation of humanity as an end in itself, FH. Kant phrases it like this. So, act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means.
Treat humanity always as an end, never merely as a means. What does humanity mean here, and what's an end in itself?
By humanity, Kant essentially means rational nature, the capacity we have for rational thought, for setting goals, for making choices based on reason. This capacity, he argues, has absolute intrinsic worth. It's an objective end. It's something valuable, not just because it helps us get something else we want, that would be a relative end, a mere means, but its value exists as an end in itself. Its worth isn't conditional on our desires.
And this is a foundation for the idea of human dignity.
Absolutely. This formulation is the bedrock of Kant's powerful concept of human dignity. Because rational nature is an end in itself, every being possessing it has intrinsic value, which the source explicitly calls dignity. And dignity, for Kant, places a being infinitely above any price. Things with a price, like commodities, market price, or things satisfying taste, luxury price, can be exchanged for something else of equivalent value. But dignity is non-negotiable, irreplaceable, unconditional worth. And this dignity ultimately comes from our capacity as rational beings to be autonomous, to give universal moral laws to ourselves and be subject to them.
So treating humanity as an end means more than just, not using people like tools.
Much more. It's about fundamentally respecting that intrinsic worth, that rational agency in both others and ourselves. It means recognizing that every person is a being capable of setting their own goals, making their own rational choices. To treat someone merely as a means is to disregard or bypass their rational agency, to use them in a way that they couldn't rationally consent to achieve your own ends.
Like the false promise example again.
Perfect illustration. When you make a false promise to get money, you're using the lender merely as a means. You are manipulating their rational decision-making by feeding them false information, preventing them from making an informed, autonomous choice about lending you the money based on the real situation. You're essentially hijacking their rationality for your own purpose.
So this formulation gives a strong basis against manipulation, coercion, deception.
Very strong. As the source notes, it leads directly to powerful injunctions against these actions because they fundamentally disrespect the other person's or your own rational nature, treating it simply as an instrument. The value of humanity as an end in itself acts as a strict limiting condition on all our actions. Any maxim that involves treating rational nature merely as a means is morally forbidden, null and void. It puts a human face, you might say, on the abstract requirement of universal law. The law respects this inherent value.
It really grounds morality in the value of rational beings themselves.
Okay, what about the third main formulation? The third is often called the formulation of the kingdom of ends, FKE. The sources give slightly different but related phrasings, like linking it back to FUL. Act as though your maxim were by your will to become a universal law of nature. But a more distinct phrasing capturing the core idea is, act in accordance with the maxims of a member giving universal laws for a merely possible kingdom of ends. This one emphasizes the idea of a moral community.
A kingdom of ends. How does this tie the first two formulations, universal law and humanity, as an end together?
Well, the source suggests that the very idea of every rational being's will being a will-giving universal law, which connects to FUL and autonomy, leads directly to this concept. The fact that our maxims can be fit for universal legislation is precisely what gives rational beings their status as ends in themselves, connecting to FH. It's our capacity for autonomous law-giving that grants us dignity. So we must always act from the perspective of being a legislator, a law-giving member, in a possible community of all rational beings who are also ends in themselves.
So this kingdom of ends is like an ideal society. A hypothetical world where everyone acts perfectly morally, following the laws they rationally give to themselves and everyone else.
That's a good way to put it. Kant describes it as a world of rational beings, mundus intelligibilis, which is possible as a kingdom of ends, precisely because it's united by common objective moral laws, laws that are the legislation proper to all persons as members. When you're deciding how to act, you should choose your maxim, as if you were not just an individual subject to the law, but also a legislator for this ideal moral community.
The source mentions an analogy to the kingdom of nature.
Yes, Kant draws an analogy. The kingdom of nature operates according to external laws of cause and effect necessity from without. The kingdom of ends, this ideal moral world, operates according to laws derived from reason, specifically maxims that rational beings freely adopt and impose upon themselves necessity from within through autonomy. The structure is analogous, but the source of the laws is fundamentally different.
And what if the real world doesn't look anything like this ideal kingdom of ends? What if people don't follow these rules?
Kant is very clear on this point. Even if this ideal kingdom never fully comes about, even if other people consistently fail to act morally, and even if nature doesn't reward you with happiness just for being a dutiful member, the moral law still commands categorically. It remains in full force. The moral worth of your action doesn't depend on whether others follow suit or whether you get rewarded. It lies in the disinterested conduct itself, in choosing to act from duty, guided by the idea of being a legislator in this kingdom, regardless of the actual state of the world or the consequences for yourself.
Okay, so these three formulations, universal law, humanity as an end, kingdom of ends, they're different lenses for looking at the same core command of reason. Testing universalizability, respecting rational nature, acting as a legislator in a moral community.
That's the general idea, yes. As the source mentions, Kant thought they were fundamentally the same law presented differently, though exactly how they are equivalent and how they work together is a rich area for philosophical discussion. But they all point towards that unconditional demand of the categorical imperative.
And driving this whole engine, the goodwill, duty, the categorical imperative in all its forms is Kant's concept of freedom. Without freedom, none of this works.
Absolutely essential. Morality, for Kant, is inextricably linked to freedom. In fact, you could say morality is only possible because we are free. This takes his argument to another really deep level, connecting morality directly to what he calls autonomy.
Autonomy. What exactly does Kant mean by that?
The sources define autonomy of the will as that property of it, by which it is a law unto itself, independently of any property of the objects of volition. It's the will's capacity for self-governance, its ability to give itself its own law rather than being governed by external factors or internal inclinations. And the principle of autonomy, it's stated as always to choose so that the maxims of the choice are contained in the same volition as a universal law.
Wait, that sounds exactly like the categorical imperative again.
It is the categorical imperative. An autonomous will is precisely a will that acts according to the categorical imperative because that imperative is the law that a rational will gives to itself.
So a will is autonomous when it follows laws, but laws that originate from its own reason, not from outside.
Precisely. And this capacity for self-legislation is only possible if the will is free. Kant understands freedom first in a negative sense, independence from being determined by external causes. This includes our own desires and inclinations, which he sees as empirical forces operating on the will, not from its rational core.
Okay, freedom from external determination.
But, Kant argues, a will that's free in this negative sense can't just be chaotic or lawless. The very concept of causality implies laws. So if the will is free from external causal laws, like laws of physics or psychology, it must be operating according to some other kind of law. And what could that be? It must be acting according to the laws it gives itself. This is freedom in the positive sense. The will's capacity to determine itself through reason alone. And this positive freedom is autonomy.
Because if its own rational activity is determining its action, it must be following the laws inherent in reason itself.
Exactly. A free will, Kant says, must act according to immutable laws, but of a special kind, namely, the laws of its own rational legislation. The source asks rhetorically, what else could freedom of the will possibly be but autonomy, this property of the will being a law to itself? And the principle, the will is in every action a law to itself, just as the principle of the categorical imperative. Act only on maxims that can be universal laws.
Which leads to that incredibly tight connection Kant draws. A free will and a will subject to moral laws are one and the same.
Yes. They're essentially two sides of the same coin. Autonomy of the will being its own lawgiver through reason is the sole principle of morals. Kant believes you can demonstrate this just by analyzing the concept of morality itself. You find its principle has to be a categorical imperative, which commands precisely this autonomy. If the will were determined by anything else, by desire for happiness, by fear of God, by social convention, it would be heteronymous.
Heteronymous.
Meaning other-lawed, determined by something outside its own rational legislation. And actions stemming from heteronomy, for Kant, lack true moral necessity and universal validity. Only autonomous actions springing from the will's free self-legislation according to reason have moral worth.
Okay, but this raises a huge question. How do we actually know we're free? From a scientific perspective, it often looks like our actions are determined by all sorts of factors: genetics, upbringing, brain chemistry, social pressures.
This is a massive issue, and Kant tackles it by making a crucial distinction between two different ways we can view ourselves, two standpoints. He argues that from a practical standpoint, the standpoint of acting, choosing, deliberating, we must regard ourselves as free.
We have to assume we're free to even make a choice.
That's his claim. He says all rational beings necessarily act under the idea of freedom. Whenever we deliberate about what to do, weigh reasons, make a choice even about something trivial like what to have for breakfast, we are implicitly presupposing that we could choose otherwise. We don't experience ourselves as simply puppets whose strings are pulled by desires or external forces. The very act of practical reasoning assumes we are the free cause of our actions.
So there's the scientific view of us as part of nature, governed by deterministic laws, and then there's the practical view of ourselves as free, rational agents making choices.
Exactly. Kant formalizes this with his distinction between the sensible world, phenomena, and the intelligible world, noumena. As beings who can be observed and studied empirically, subject to natural laws, physical, psychological, etc., we belong to the sensible world. Our actions, viewed from this perspective, are appearances, events in time that can potentially be explained by chains of cause and effect, influenced by desires and inclinations. This is the realm of natural necessity, and if our will were only determined here, it would be heteronymous.
But we're not just phenomena.
No. As rational beings, capable of thinking and acting based on principles of reason, we also consider ourselves as belonging to the intelligible world. This isn't a place you can visit. It's a standpoint of reason. It's the realm of things as they are in themselves, beyond empirical observation. Practical reason, Kant says, thinks itself into this world. As an intelligence, a rational being belongs to this intelligible world, and the causality originating from this rational self is what Kant calls a will.
And this intelligible world somehow grounds the sensible world.
Yes, in a crucial way for morality. Kant argues the intelligible world contains the ground, the ultimate basis of the sensible world, and therefore also the ground of its laws. Since our reason belongs entirely to this intelligible world, reason is directly law-giving for our will, which operates in the sensible world through our actions. Therefore, because we are members of both worlds, empirical creatures subject to inclinations and rational intelligences grounded in the intelligible world, we find ourselves subject to the law of the intelligible world. And that law is the law of reason, the moral law, the law of autonomy, derived from the idea of freedom. So the laws of the intelligible world, the moral laws, present themselves to us as beings also in the sensible world, as imperatives, as commands we ought to follow, and actions conforming to them are duties.
Wow, that's mind-bending. Trying to hold both perspectives at once being determined in the sensible world but free in the intelligible world. How can both be true of the same person?
And Kant readily admits this is where reason hits a hard limit. The sources are clear. Reason would overstep all its bounds if it tried to explain how pure reason can be practical, how thought alone can make us act, or, crucially, how freedom itself is possible. Freedom, he concludes, remains a mere idea of reason. Its objective reality, its possibility, can't be proven or demonstrated through experience or according to natural laws. We can't fully comprehend or see how it operates.
So we can't explain it, we can't prove it empirically, but we have to presuppose it for morality to make sense.
That's exactly Kant's position. It's a necessary presupposition for any being who is conscious of having a will, a faculty that determines itself according to reason, distinct from mere instinct or desire. Where explanation based on natural law stops, Kant says all we can do is offer a defense against objections. He argues the apparent contradiction between freedom from the intelligible standpoint and determinism from the sensible standpoint arises only if we mistakenly think of the human being in the exact same sense or under the exact same conditions when we consider them as free versus when we consider them as part of nature. Philosophy's task, he suggests, is to show that these two standpoints, viewing ourselves as intelligence versus viewing ourselves as appearance, are compatible and necessarily united in us, even if the ultimate how of freedom remains inscrutable. It's a necessary postulate of practical reason.
And underpinning this whole complex structure, the goodwill, duty, the CI, autonomy, is this insistence that the moral law must come from reason alone, entirely separate from experience.
Absolutely fundamental. That's Kant's unwavering commitment to the a priori nature of morality.
Why is it so critically important for Kant that moral concepts originate purely from reason, completely independent of anything we learn through experience?
Because, for Kant, only an a priori origin can give moral laws the kind of universal authority and absolute necessity that he believes morality requires. He argues, as the source states, that all moral concepts find their seat and origin completely a priori in reason, in everyday common sense reason, just as much as in sophisticated philosophical reason.
So they aren't generalizations from observing human behavior or figuring out what leads to happiness.
Definitely not. They cannot be abstracted from any empirical and therefore merely contingent cognitions. Morality is known independently of experience. This is vital because any rule derives from experience, like observing what generally makes people happy or what societies tend to approve of, would inevitably be contingent. It might hold true often, or for some people, but it wouldn't have the absolute necessity and universality required of a true moral law. It would just be an empirical generalization, not a moral command binding on all rational beings as such.
So the a priori nature is what guarantees that necessity and universality.
Precisely. That's what gives moral laws their special dignity and allows them to function as supreme practical principles, carrying absolute necessity and unlimited worth. Because they're derived not from the particular facts of human nature or experience, but from the universal concept of a rational being itself, they must hold for every rational being as such. not just humans, but any conceivable rational being.
And Kant really hammers this point home, criticizing any attempt to base morality on empirical grounds.
Oh, absolutely. He's relentless on this. He sees looking for moral principles in empirical factors, human feelings, desires for happiness, consequences, even divine commands, understood merely as external edicts, as a lax and even mean way of thinking. He warns it's highly prejudicial to the purity of morals. Why? Because it inevitably leads to mixing pure rational requirements with contingent empirical elements, creating what he colorfully calls a Baskern patched up from limbs of various derivation. These mixed-up principles, he argues, lack the clear, unconditional authority of pure moral law and ultimately can't provide a reliable guide for action. They muddy the waters.
So you can't even learn morality by looking at role models at supposedly virtuous people.
Not according to Kant. Examples, he argues, can never ground morality or provide its first principles. Any example of virtue, even Christ, according to Kant, must first be judged by the a priori concept of moral perfection before we can recognize it as virtuous. Examples might serve for encouragement, showing us that acting morally is possible, but they can't replace reason as the original source. Trying to build a popular morality by blending rational concepts with empirical observations about human nature or feelings is fundamentally misguided, because it fails to isolate the pure a priori principles that must form the foundation.
So digging down to find these pure concepts in reason and keeping them unmixed isn't just some abstract philosophical exercise for Kant. It's crucial for practice.
Yes, he stresses it's of the greatest practical importance. It's essential for establishing a morality that's truly universal and necessary, binding on all rational beings simply because they are rational. It has to be derived from the pure concept of rationality itself, not from the specific contingent features of human beings. Without this pure a priori philosophical grounding, Kant believed, a stable, truly authoritative system of morality would be simply impossible to construct.
It's undeniable when you go through, like this Kant's Groundwork is just a monumental, foundational text in the history of ethics.
It truly is. It really did establish a distinctively pure, rational approach to moral philosophy. It identified the supreme principle as the categorical imperative and, crucially, grounded it in the autonomy, the self-legislating freedom of the rational will. It's the absolute cornerstone of deontological ethics.
Deontology. Let's clarify how Kant's approach contrasts sharply with other major ways of thinking about ethics.
Okay, so deontological theories, with Kant as the prime example, judge the morality of an action based on whether it conforms to a moral rule or duty. The focus is on the inherent rightness or wrongness of the act itself, or the principle behind it, not on the consequences it produces. Certain actions are forbidden, others are required based on these rules or duties, often regardless of the outcome. You could say, the right following duty takes precedence over the good, achieving desirable results.
So it's fundamentally different from, say, consequentialism, like utilitarianism.
Worlds apart, really. Consequentialist theories, like the utilitarianism developed by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill that the sources mention, judge an act entirely by its consequences. Is the action likely to produce the best overall outcome? For Bentham, that meant maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, his famous greatest happiness of the greatest number principle. The morality of the act lies solely in its results, its utility. Motives, for Bentham, were relevant to judging the person, maybe, but not the rightness of the act itself. Mill refined this but kept the core focus on consequences, happiness, pleasure. Kant completely rejects this. For him, consequences are irrelevant to the moral worth of an action, which resides entirely in the goodwill acting from duty, regardless of results.
And how does it stack up against something like virtue ethics or the sentimentalist approach of someone like David Hume, who's also mentioned?
Also very different. Sentimentalists like Hume ground morality in human feelings and emotions. For Hume, moral judgments aren't primarily about rational principles or duties, but about personal merit. Which character traits or motives tend to evoke feelings of approval or disapproval in observers, usually based on whether those traits are useful or agreeable to ourselves or others. Moral ideas arise from a kind of moral sense, as the source indicates you're sort of struck by rightness or wrongness, much like you perceive beauty. It's rooted in empirical psychology, in feelings of pleasure and pain. Kant, again, stands in stark opposition. His ethics is all about duty, law, and respect for that law, derived from pure a priori reason, not from contingent and variable human feelings or senses. Morality's foundation must be rational and universal, not empirical and subjective. Virtue ethics, often associated with Aristotle, also differs by focusing more on developing good character traits, virtues, as the basis of a good life, rather than Kant's primary focus on rules, duties, and the will's conformity to the moral law.
Given how absolute the categorical imperative is and how strict its demands seem, it's no surprise Kant's philosophy has faced a lot of criticism over the years.
Oh, definitely. It's powerful, but it invites challenges. One of those common criticisms is its perceived rigidity. The absolute, exceptionless nature of the categorical imperative, especially concerning perfect duties like the prohibition against lying, can seem overly inflexible. Critics argue that surely there must be situations where, for example, telling a lie might seem morally preferable, maybe even necessary, to prevent a terrible harm. Kant's famous insistence, mentioned in the sources, that the duty to tell the truth is absolute because any exception would undermine the very possibility of truthful communication and right, strikes many as too severe, ignoring complex contexts.
So the criticism is that real life is messy, and sometimes strict adherence to a rule seems to lead to worse outcomes or violate other moral intuitions.
Exactly. And related to that is the difficulty of application. Applying the universal law test isn't always straightforward. How exactly do you formulate the maxim for a complex action? What counts as a contradiction in conception or will? Different people might apply the test differently and reach different conclusions. Translating the abstract formulations into clear guidance for complicated real-world moral dilemmas can be genuinely challenging.
And then there's the sheer demandingness of acting purely from duty.
Yes, that's perhaps the criticism that resonates most personally for many. The idea that only actions done solely and purely from duty, untainted by any inclination, self-interest, or desire for good consequences, possess true moral worth. That's an incredibly high bar. As we discussed, it makes us wonder if such pure motivation is even psychologically realistic, or if true virtue, in Kant's strict sense, is ever actually achieved. It seems to devalue actions done from genuine love or compassion if duty isn't the sole conscious driver.
And that puzzle about freedom still looms.
It does. Kant's admission that we can't explain or prove freedom, but must presuppose it for morality, while philosophically coherent within his system, remains a point of attack for determinists or those looking for a more empirically grounded account of human agency. It rests on a metaphysical distinction between the sensible and intelligible worlds that many find difficult to accept or fully grasp.
And yet, despite all these criticisms, despite the philosophical knots and the sheer difficulty, the questions Kant raises in the groundwork just don't go away. They feel incredibly relevant.
They absolutely are. Kant forces you to confront the most fundamental questions about ethics head-on. What is the ultimate basis of right and wrong? Is it reason? Is it feeling? Is it consequences? What does it mean to have a duty? And what does that duty demand of us at its core? How does our freedom relate to the moral constraints we feel? And maybe most profoundly, what is the real source and nature of human dignity, that unconditional worth we feel people possess?
So, recapping our deep dive. We started with Kant's claim about the unique, unqualified value of the goodwill. We unpacked the critical difference between acting merely in conformity with duty and acting from duty, driven by respect for the moral law. We grappled with the categorical imperative, this unconditional command of reason, exploring its main formulations, the test of universal law, the principle of treating humanity as an end in itself, and the idea of acting as a legislator in a kingdom of ends. And we saw how Kant ties this entire moral framework to our autonomy and freedom as rational beings, operating within both a sensible and an intelligible realm.
It's been a journey through Kant's ambitious project to establish morality on a foundation of pure reason alone, creating a system of ethics he believed was universal and necessary for all rational beings, completely independent of the shifting sands of inclination, consequence, or empirical circumstance.
And it feels like we've really only scratched the surface here. The groundwork is dense, it's rich, and it's profoundly shaped how we think about ethics ever since. It continues to spark debate and deep reflection.
And maybe that persistence is its greatest strength. Kant leaves us with a challenge, doesn't he? He pushes us to look beyond the immediate results of our actions, beyond the feelings that might motivate us, and to ask those harder, more fundamental questions. Could the principle I'm acting on right now reasonably become a law for everyone? What does it truly mean to respect the humanity, the rational core, in myself and others? What does it mean to act not just like I have a duty, but from that duty, purely out of respect for what reason demands? And perhaps the most provocative thought, in recognizing that we are bound by this moral law that stems from our own reason, aren't we simultaneously recognizing the incredible scope of our own freedom and the profound unconditional dignity that comes with it? Those aren't easy questions, but grappling with them feels essential if we want to seriously consider what it means to live a truly moral life.